of you does things to me never before. Has someone been more
unforgettable in every way,
and forevermore?
and forevermore.
That's how you'll stay.
That's how you'll stay.
That's why, darling,
impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true to this glorious quest, that my heart will lay peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know if I'll only be true to this glorious quest, that my heart will lay peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest. And the world will be better for this than one man scorned and covered with scars, still strove with his lessons of courage, to fight the unbeatable foe, to reach the unreachable star.
Please be seated. Welcome to this celebration of a life of service. We come from many faiths and perspectives, brought together by a desire to remember and honor the life of John Glenn. In this service, we won't begin to capture the depth and breadth of the life he led, but we will try. We will try. And this afternoon, we will also celebrate the unfailing promises of God. We remember that God's love for us is stronger than death. Today, we hold fast to that truth as we celebrate Senator Glenn's life. Now, please join me in our call to worship. Before God spoke the first word of creation, there was love. When we draw our last breath and leave this world, love will be waiting for us. Then let us worship God.
Looking back on it now, it was almost an idyllic place, I think, to have a childhood. Patriotism and feelings about the country were just a given. You expected that. It wasn't something that was rare. And so it was, as I look back on it now, all the influences on whether it was religious thought or morals or ethical behavior or whatever, it was almost an idyllic place for kids to grow up. I had a teacher in high school that really affected my later life. His name was Harford Steele. And Harvard Steele taught a course that was called civics at that time, which was the study of government and politics. And he was a wonderful teacher. He just made the whole thing come alive. And I used to really look forward to his classes. It was something that really inspired me later on.
God, our refuge and strength, you're always close to us in every moment of our lives. Meet us now in this time of sadness and lift our eyes to the peace and light of your constant care. Help us to hear your words of grace, that any fear we might have will be dispelled by your love, and loneliness eased by your presence, and our hope renewed by your promises. We gather this day in this place to grieve Senator John Glenn's death and to celebrate a life well lived and to rejoice in his new life that will never end. Bless also those he loved who are gathered here today. Pour out your blessings on this assembly and allow your grace to be our guide. Sustain us, O Lord, with your comfort and presence today and always. We pray this in your name, all gracious God. Amen.
The following is a passage that is read on Yom Kippur. It's the holiest day of the Jewish year and lends perspective to the inevitable cycle of life. If some messenger were to come to us with the offer that death should be overthrown, but with the one inseparable condition that birth should also cease. If we who live here today were given the chance to live forever, but on the clear understanding that never again would there be a child or a youth or first love, never again new persons with new hopes, new ideas, new achievements. Ourselves, always and forever. Could the answer be in doubt? As John Glenn lived, let us treasure the time we have and resolve to use it well. Let us live deliberately and make each moment count, a chance to apprehend some truth, to experience some beauty, to conquer some evil, to relieve some suffering, to love and be loved, to achieve something of lasting value. Help us to fulfill the promise that is in each of us, so that when we are gone, another generation will say, our world is better because, for a brief time, we lived. It has been said that people come into our lives for a reason, and I think we have all been blessed by the extraordinary life of John Glenn.
So I got my private pilot's license in the spring of 1941, and then Pearl Harbor occurred.
A date which will live in infamy.
I knew what my responsibilities were at that time. My dad and mother weren't too keen for me dropping out of school at that time, but it was my duty to do, and I did it. I was impressed with the Marine Corps and felt the Marines were the best, and I wanted to be part of that.
Please join me in saying the words of the 23rd Psalm as printed in your programs. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
It's a privilege to say a few words in honor of our esteemed friend and colleague. There are those here today who have known Senator Glenn for 60, 70, or even 90 years. But most of us knew him long before we actually met him. We knew him through news reports and flickering images of events that were among the most spectacular we had ever witnessed. The suspense of the countdown, the majesty of the liftoff, the technical brilliance. Our nation was proud of the achievement and proud of our brave and dashing hero. But more than that, we cared about him personally. We prayed for him personally, for his family, for his happiness and his safety. The mission captured our minds, but John Glenn won our hearts. There are many reasons for that. Foremost among them was the quality of John Glenn, the man. A decorated combat veteran, a fearless test pilot, but also, and importantly, a dedicated husband and father. He was very much like all of us. A superhuman work ethic, perhaps, but in so many other ways, like our father, our brother, our husband, our neighbor from New Concord, Ohio. And he was a consummate teammate. He put complete faith in those who supported him and then risked it all, so vulnerable and so human, in that tiny capsule to show us that we could succeed. This gave millions of us the confidence to know that we could reach our dreams. His service life, stretching over the past half-century, was exemplary and inspiring. From the beginning and throughout, he radiated authenticity and confident, perfect humility. He was the opposite of boastful. As truly outstanding people do, he let his actions speak for themselves. He was competitive, but his accomplishments were always in the context of doing his best to do a good job, to allow himself to be a role model. And to our everlasting fortune, he returned home, to his home, to Ohio, and after leaving office, to the Ohio State University, which he loved dearly and served energetically and with distinction as a faculty member and elder statesman throughout the last years of his life. We are eternally grateful. In that context, we met John Glenn during the recruitment process for this position. We were appropriately very flattered that he would take time to come out to the airport on a Sunday afternoon. But the main memory from that meeting was that we learned immediately that there was much more to him than we had appreciated from afar. And that more was Annie. The two of them together radiated warmth and optimism. The bond between them was palpable. In meeting Annie, we shook hands and she smiled and then didn't let go. As we talked, she held my hand for several minutes, as though I were a grandson returning home, and we spoke as though we had known each other for years. And that easy, open greeting welcomed us to the community. After moving to Columbus, we had the pleasure to visit with John and Annie on several occasions, some private, some public. Two bear mention today. The first was the dedication of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs. He was passionate about education and the college and honored that it bore his name. He was thrilled at the varied backgrounds and interests of the students, tomorrow's leaders. He was ever present in his office or attending events or welcoming dignitaries, always doing his best to inspire by example, a consistent, unwavering theme in his life. The dedication was on a brisk, crystal bright spring day. The trees on the oval were bursting with new life. The excited crowd was gathered facing the steps outside Page Hall. In fact, it looked just like the scene you see behind me. And the crowd was so large that it spread out across the street onto the other side of College Road. And the scene was of cars just visible above the heads of the people in the foreground, snaking slowly through the crowd. And it was reminiscent eerily of something, and it took a few minutes to grasp, and then it came that it was really reminiscent, and it dawned that it looked just like a ticker tape parade for an honored native son, as though it were February 1962 all over again, a sign from above, perhaps, of a job well done and great things to come. The second moment to share occurred just over a year ago, this time at a social dinner for the four of us at a local restaurant. It was like an old school double date. And we were talking broadly about university life and the events of the day, and the conversation turned to the 1960s and their friendships with members of the Kennedy family and the fateful events of June 1968. He shared a story you all know well, that after Senator Kennedy was wounded, the Glenns were asked by the Kennedy family to take the 5 children who were in California with them back to the home in Virginia and to watch over them while events in Los Angeles unfolded, and this they did. On the morning of the second day, he got the call, and it fell to him to draw the children together to share the unspeakable news. So he said he called them into a room and sat on the edge of a bed, and then as he was reliving this moment, his voice broke and he couldn't continue a half a century later. And reflexly, I reached out and took his hand, and then I caught myself wondering if I had unwittingly crossed some privilege of familiarity. But before I acted, he squeezed my hand. and held it tightly, and then after a pause said that telling those kids that their father was gone was the toughest thing he'd ever done. And it took him then a few minutes to regain composure. And I felt in that moment, when he was so powerful yet so vulnerable, so human, I felt what it means to be steadfast, what it means to be reliable, what it means to be compassionate, to be loving, and why those measures of character are so important, why they matter so much. And in that moment, more than flights around the planet, or the bravery of defending our nation under arms, or decades of being a servant leader in our university or our government, in that moment he exemplified the transcendent beauty of true courage. As we bask in the glow of greatness, we are uplifted and inspired. Inspired because we too can be steadfast and true. We can be compassionate. He lived an outstanding life in a way that exemplified the value and power of being our best. We can honor him by doing what we can every day to be our best selves. There can be no more powerful legacy, no more impactful legacy. A man for the ages leaves us with a message for the ages. Godspeed, John Glenn. Godspeed indeed.
When I came back from Korea, I had applied to go through test pilot training and was accepted for that. And I thought to be able to work out some of the bugs on the new airplanes would be just about the ultimate in flying.
Marine Airman Major John Glenn begins an attempt at a supersonic transcontinental flight. 2,460 miles traversed, elapsed time 3 hours and 23 minutes, 8.4 seconds.
We broke the record by quite a bit, by 20 minutes or so.
To Annie, the true source of John's remarkable strength for their many years together. To David and Lynn, who shared their father with a grateful nation. I am honored to be here today to celebrate the life of a man I am proud to have called both a hero and a friend. Only a handful of people in history have been called upon to publicly embody the ideals of an entire nation. Fewer still have stood to the task in both wartime and peace, and none have answered the call more perfectly than John Glenn. He became my hero early in my career as a Marine and still is today. He defined an age of American history in 3 storied institutions, but whether he was orbiting the Earth or the Senate floor, he was always a Marine. On his way to attend Annie's organ recital one day, John heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Anyone who knows Annie understands what a sacrifice it was for John to put their marriage plans on hold, leave college, and join the fight. Anyone who knew John understands that he didn't see a choice. He saw his duty to serve. He tried to join the Army Air Corps, but they couldn't take him fast enough. Instead, he entered the military through the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, where he met his lifelong friend, Tom Miller. He chose the Marine Corps for the same reason many of us do, because we have the best-looking uniforms. After he earned his wings, he and his buddy Tom were first assigned to a transport squadron. This was not in their plan. Here we see one of the first examples of what he called selective opportunity. This is where you see an opportunity and you position yourself to be competitive for the position. On this occasion, it backfired. He and his pal Tom heard that the Marine Corps was going to get P-38 Lightnings, a very fine fighter being flown by the Army Air Corps. While they were still in flight training, they reasoned that if they were trained as multi-engine pilots, that would give them a leg up on being competitive for this twin-engine fighter. The Marine Corps did not get the P-38, but they got multi-engine squadron, and not the fighters they maneuvered so skillfully to get. But just across the field were two fighter squadrons, so he and pal Tom walked over and asked for a transfer. That story sounds simple now, but John's version involved being chewed out by his colonel like something from a movie. This would not be the last time John paid the price for positioning himself for an assignment. On another occasion, John, only a lieutenant at this time, talked Charles Lindbergh into lending him his demonstration fighter, which Lindbergh was touring to bases around the country. This audacity led to another pointed conversation with his squadron commander. Even then, the country was having to hustle to keep up with John Glenn. We admired the determination he brought to the work, but he wasn't in it for himself. Service to the nation was personal for him. He lost his wingman on his very first combat mission. He understood the risk. He knew firsthand the heavy task of gathering a friend's personal effects and writing the letter to the next of kin. John went on to fly 149 combat missions in 2 wars. He never shirked from danger. He drew enemy fire like a magnet, giving rise to one of his more infamous nicknames, which I can't repeat here. He shot down 3 MiGs, and on 2 occasions he landed with more than 250 bullet holes in his airplane. But the man himself was bulletproof. John's exemplary service in 2 wars earned him a slot as a test pilot at Tucson River. His most memorable mission was to fly supersonic across the country and set the world speed record. And it was to test the durability of engines in continuous afterburner. It's important to note that the limit on those engines was 5 minutes. He crossed the country in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and proved that the engine was a lot better than we had thought it was. But he called it Project Bullet because he was going to be flying faster than a .45 caliber pistol bullet. And it turned out during this flight, unbeknownst to him, conditions were perfect over a part of the country for sonic booms, which he drugged from Indianapolis to his hometown of New Concord, rattling windows the whole way. It wasn't the last America was to hear from the world's fastest Marine. The motto at Marine Officer Candidate School in Quantico is Ductus Exemplo, lead by example. And John set a fight example for us all. His wingman in Korea, the great baseball player Ted Williams, once called him one of the calmest men I have ever met, no matter how perilous the situation. He might have been referring to an occasion where Williams was hit by anti-aircraft fire and his plane was ablaze. John pulled alongside, pointed up, and they climbed to a higher altitude, and with the lack of oxygen, the flames were actually extinguished and Williams made it back to base. Of all the war stories, this one perhaps best illustrates what John meant to us. He invited us up to his level, where we discovered what an American could do. He once said he had been a Marine for 23 years and it just wasn't enough. We had John for 95 great years and it still wasn't enough. A long, full life is a gift, and John made his a gift to us all. And today we say thank you for the service and sacrifice, for the faith and the friendship, and for always leading us higher. Even though the Marines hymn was written over 200 years ago, they had John Glenn in mind when they wrote the lines, "First to fight for right and freedom and to keep our honor clean." We're proud to claim the title of United States Marine. Colonel John Glenn has made his last takeoff, and he'll be missed, but never forgotten.
Seven, 6, 5, Godspeed, 4, John Glenn. 3, 2, there 1, the ignition of the vernier. 0, ignition, liftoff.
Word astronaut wasn't even known back when I was growing up. That came along later. I loved it. I'd like to go up every day.
This week, our nation has been mourning the loss of one of its greatest heroes, John Glenn. His passing has affected me deeply, but in the spirit of optimism that he has always radiated, I'd also like us to remember his many achievements and the pioneering spirit that he exemplified. I also want to thank Annie, Lynn, and David, and the entire Glenn family for sharing their husband, father, grandfather with the world. Every one of us on planet Earth has benefited from having him on our team. Annie, you and John exemplified for all of us what it means to be united as a couple. Your love and friendship over 73 years is unlike anything I've ever seen. I'm glad and incredibly blessed that I was able to witness your devotion. I hope that Jackie and I can emulate your lifetime of love. I was so moved and humored when I called John and Annie earlier this year to congratulate them on their 73rd anniversary. When John put Annie on the phone, she said, and I quote, "Charlie, you know, I think this is going to work." Unquote. John Glenn always said yes. Yes to his country's call in the United States Marine Corps. Yes to being the first American to orbit Earth as one of Mercury's 7. Yes to his state's nomination to serve in the Senate, and yes to the ongoing call of his nation to help it forge a path through a new millennium. It was courage, grace, and humility John displayed throughout his life that lifted him above the stars. As the current head of NASA, I can say unequivocally that we are standing on John Glenn's shoulders as we pursue a human journey to Mars, a journey that would not be possible without his bravery and selfless dedication. I know that, and countless other astronauts who had the privilege of following Senator Glenn into space can pinpoint his remarkable accomplishment as the first American to orbit Earth as the seed of our aspirations. Even in his 70s, he continued to break barriers as he took to space again in the space shuttle. I was so proud to see this American legend soar again on Discovery's STS-95 mission. Just as with his first flight, he planted a seed that someday Americans from all walks of life might experience space and the wonder of our planet from orbit and see it as a unified whole. Kennedy Space Center Director Bob Cabana, another Marine, recalls of that time just how excited John was to once again be one of the guys, and how happy and blessed he felt to continue his role in the space program he loved and valued so much. Steve Lindsay, who is with us today, flew with John Glenn as the pilot of STS-95 on Discovery. Steve said, and I quote, "What I learned about John through that experience is that he was authentic. Every bit the hero the world and our nation holds him to be. John was, at his core, a man of integrity, humility, and kindness. Someone who put others ahead of himself, a team player, and someone you could always count on," unquote. John Glenn always represented the best of our American ideals. His personal popularity was enormous, perhaps because he was so approachable, so genuine. People felt as though he could sit down in their parlor for a chat and be right at home. Or like Steve Lindsay says, that he would be a great neighbor. John Glenn was deeply compassionate. He valued everyone, no matter his race or gender. He was ahead of his time in many ways. It was he who personally requested that Katherine Johnson, a black woman from West Virginia, from White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, working as a human computer at the Langley Research Center, he requested that Katherine Johnson do the verifying of the calculations for his historic flight as a backup to the IBM electric computer. John was just like that. John made us look up, not only to the sky, thinking we might actually be able to see him up there, but toward the higher purpose that we as a country are always striving to achieve. He represented innovation and bravery, and with that infectious grin, he made us all feel good about ourselves. John first flew to space aboard Friendship 7, and he was truly a friend of humanity, a daring pilot who risked his life in World War II in Korea and worked tirelessly to advance the field of aviation long before he took to space. He dared the utmost on behalf of us all. It is fitting that this day also marks the 113th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first powered flight. Just as John advanced the frontiers of aviation, that's right, Lynn, so too we will follow his legacy to us, to travel farther in space. John Glenn received many accolades, but his true measure is taken not in awards, but in the respect he still commands on both ends of the political spectrum. By the large shadow he cast on our entire endeavor to travel farther into the solar system, and by the bright flame of his inspiration, which continues to illuminate our way. Godspeed, John Glenn, and thank you. We will never forget you.
I decided it was time to go and do some other things. Thought about politics and government work sometime, but I had no idea that I ever would be able to do that myself. You know, I'd thought about that since I was a kid. I was proud of my combat service I'd had in World War II and in Korea, proud of the test work I had done, being able to contribute in orbital flight. And if I wasn't to continue in that area, where could I do the best and do the best for the country? That's where I decided to run for public office. Your interests in the Senate are across the breadth and to the depth of everything that's in this country.
Excuse me. When John Glenn was 10 years old, his father, his hero, a veteran of World War I, taught him how to play taps on the bugle. They'd play together Memorial Day in New Concord, small flags and flowers next to grave sites, gravestones of the fallen. And John would recall that time and feeling when he said, where love of country was a given, defense of its ideals was an obligation, and the opportunity to join in its conquests and explorations was a challenge, not only to fulfill a sacred duty, but to join a joyous adventure. With John, all the years I knew him and worked with him, it was always a joyous adventure. Annie, what a joyous adventure you and John had together, on display for your children and the whole world to see. You all know it. You can tell when a couple really genuinely loves and enjoys one another. It was infectious. On behalf of President Obama and the First Lady, on behalf of the American people, Jill and I are here because we love you, Annie, and we love John. And together, you taught us all how to love. That's not something you usually talk about when you talk about heroes, especially heroes like John Glenn, who lived a life that was rigorous but tinged with just a little bit of magic. Just a little bit of magic. We talk about daring spirit, poise under pressure, mental and physical toughness, but for all his heroism that history will remember, in war, in space, in public life, you felt something deeper with John. Annie, on the way to get to Air Force Two, I got a call from John Kerry, who's somewhere over the Atlantic on the way to another mission in the Middle East to try to deal with Yemen. And he told me about his time he got to spend with you a couple days ago and the family. He pointed out, he said, Joe, you know, John's only the 9th person in the history of the state of Ohio to ever lie in state. Governor, I didn't know that. Only the 9th in history. And he said that he talked about how much it meant to him and to be with you. And he gave spontaneously what I think is maybe the best description of John Glenn I've ever heard, and I knew John for 40 years. He said, John came out of the heart of the country like you kids do, and he stole America's heart. He came out of the heart of the country, and he stole America's heart. And he did. He stole America's heart. I remember as a kid, freshman in college, John's historic flight. And Annie, you and John and Jill and I have been friends for 40 years. I know others have longer relationships, but what a wonderful 40 years it's been. We served in the Senate together side by side for 25 years, and we traveled around the world together. John was one of the happiest people I ever knew. No, think about it. One of the happiest people I ever knew. He had that infectious smile. Even when things looked like everything was crashing down, John would walk into my office or walk into a caucus with that big smile on his face, and I wonder, where in the hell has he been? Where did he not just hear what I just heard? You think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding. But the world knew, Reverend, and respected John. From Columbus to Cambodia, from Washington to Beijing. He loved being a senator. He loved his constituents and his colleagues. He loved his staff, many of whom are here today, and boy, did they love him back. And you could feel his love for his country and for his state and for the Marine Corps. He even was kind of partial to NASA. But most especially, you felt his love for you, Annie, and for Dave and Lynn and his grandchildren. All you had to do, as I said, was see John and Annie just walk together. Just the way they looked at each other. And you knew that's what it's supposed to be like. I said that to Annie today before we came in, and she said, well, that's like you and Jill. I said, no, it's different. Everybody knows I love Jill more than she loves me. I think you loved him just as much. The last time we were together, when Jill and I had Annie and John over to the vice president's residence, I was looking at the picture this morning, Annie, of you guys walking down the steps, walking out to the gate, and Jill and I behind you. And the words of the poet Christopher Marlowe literally came to mind, and I had to rewrite this on the way in the plane. Christopher Marlowe said, "Come with me and be my love, and all the pleasures we shall prove." Well, together, Annie, excuse me, you and John proved all the pleasures. You not only had a magical love affair, the other thing about you, you were partners. You were Platt partners. Together, you bore the weight of fame and responsibility with enormous humility and a sense of duty that defined you as the greatest of America's greatest generation. I think John defined what it meant to be America, what it meant to be an American, what we were about, just by how he acted. It was always about promise. We were a country of possibilities, opportunity, always a belief in tomorrow. Tomorrow. When John was at the house a couple years ago, that's all he kept talking about. Was, what are you going to do now, Joe? What are we going to do tomorrow? We have all these opportunities. Together, you and John taught us that a good life is built not on a single historic act or multiple acts of heroism, but on 1,000 little things. 1,000 little things that build character. Treating everyone with dignity and respect. John was one of the few of my colleagues, when we go into the restroom where there's a shoe shine guy, John would always pat him on the shoulder and give him a hug. Understanding that despite fame and position, everybody was John's equal. Everybody was John's equal in his mind. And it all comes down to being personal. The president always kids me, Annie, because I'm getting old enough now I could even try to improve on Tip O'Neill's admonition about all politics is local. I don't think John agreed with that either. I think he thought all politics is personal. It's all personal. It all comes down to being personal, to being there for family and being there for friends in good times and in bad times. Like you and John were there for me and Jill when I was in the hospital. You were there for us when our son Bo was deployed, and you were there when we buried him. It's all about being personal. Annie, you and John, as was mentioned earlier by the first speaker, were with Ethel. I happened to be with Ethel Kennedy at an awards ceremony in New York, the Ripple of Hope ceremony. And I was, ironically, a fellow who runs my office, who's an Ohio guy, said John wasn't doing well. You ought to call John. And I had a brief discussion with Ethel as I sat with her. And the story is well known about him talking to the kids and being sent back to Hickory Hill. But what struck me was I was told that when you and John got to Hickory Hill, John walked into Senator Kennedy's private study and saw that Robert Kennedy, who was the only political hero I ever had in my life, had out a book of Ralph Waldo Emerson's poetry. And it was opened up, and a leaf of the book, there in the margins, were comments made by Robert Kennedy. And the passage that John, I'm told, remembered was where Emerson said, "This time, like all times, is a very good one if we but know what to do with it. The thing that I liked most about John was he knew from his upbringing that ordinary Americans could do extraordinary things. Ordinary Americans do extraordinary things. And he believed, I believe, he was confident that every successive generation would know what to do with it. And that's the charge I think John left us, Annie. To join our nation's conquests and our nation's explorations as a challenge, not only to fulfill a sacred duty, but to join in this joyous adventure. So when the Marine plays taps on the bugle at Arlington for our friend, we can look deep into the heavens and know with certitude that John believed and was right, that future generations of Americans will also look deep within the heavens and understand how to explore, how to serve, how to love. They will come to understand that if we're looking for a message to send about our time here on earth, for what it means to be an American, it's the life of John Glenn, and that is not hyperbole. So God bless you, John. God bless you, Annie, and may God protect our troops.
This is a reading from the Gospel of Mark. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.
A reading from the letter of Paul to the Philippians. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Here ends the reading.
Going back to New Concord days and what maybe I experienced myself there is some of what I'm trying to pass on now to others with our school here. How do you inspire citizenship? How do you make our young people, give them a feeling of pride in community, in state and country, to where they're willing to go out and engage in political activity? Those are the kinds of things that I hope we can instill in people, not only here in Ohio, but maybe across the country.
This is quite a crowd. To all of you who came here today, thank you so very, very much. It means a lot to our family. We really were not ready to say goodbye to him yet. His mind was sharp as a tack, but his body was failing him, and this had to be. I'm going to speak about my father from the perspective of being his son, but I've had a huge amount of difficulty deciding what to say about him. In the end, I just decided to go with the things I'll tell you about today because they're really stuck in my head and my heart. I'll start off talking about his memories, and then I'll share some of my memories of him. I can't really say for sure what made him the way he was, but he was born in a happy home with two parents who loved him deeply, and he grew up in a classic American small town, New Concord, Ohio, where he could adventure and explore to his heart's content. There was a terrific community spirit there, focused around church and school and town activities. And he told us lots of stories about his friends and my mother, Annie. In particular, he never forgot the effect of the Great Depression on New Concord. When he was a kid, late one night, he overheard his parents talking about how they were going to lose their home if they couldn't make any more of the payments on their mortgage. But then one of FDR's New Deal public works programs to improve rural plumbing helped my grandfather's struggling plumbing business get off the ground, and that saved their home. Dad worked in that business as a teenager measuring and cutting pipes, and he was really proud of being a really good pipe cutter. He just told me about that earlier this year. The potential for government to do good was something that he never forgot. This was not an abstract concept to him. This was real life. Here are more memories from this early period of his life that he shared with us many times. As a little kid, he'd load some rhubarb from their rhubarb patch into his wagon and go door to door to make some extra money. He did the same thing with horseradish, and he liked to eat them both. He had a paper route, and he worked in summers as a dishwasher at a summer camp, and he played trumpet in the town band. My grandmother loved poetry, and she had him learn poems that he could recite by heart till the end of his life, and he also wrote some of his own poems. All these stories that he told us about his growing up years now feel like gifts that he left us. So now here are some things I remember about my life with my father. He loved science. When I was a kid, I remember him drawing, you have to bear with me a bit. I remember him drawing me diagrams to explain how the shape of an airplane's wing would create lift as air flowed over it. And this had something to do with something called Bernoulli's principle. And the space program, of course, was a huge passion. When I was a teenager, he spent a lot of time before his Mercury flight going through all his manuals with me and explaining all the backup systems that were hopefully going to keep him alive if something went wrong. He had also learned how to identify lots of stars in NASA, and he taught those to us when we were kids. We'd lay out in the yard at night with a blanket while he pointed them out. Here's another story. I was in my middle 20s back in 1971, an interesting time. I went to visit my parents, hadn't seen them for a while. Hair was down to my shoulders. Leather head thong around my head, a little bit different than now. Bell bottoms, the whole bit. I hadn't seen them for a while, as I said. I walked into the house, and what I remember is I think he might have blinked twice, or his face twitched, or something of that sort. But that was it. And he was only 5 or 6 years retired from being a colonel in the Marine Corps. He must have made some wisecracks at the time, but it was clear that he accepted me as I was. He really gave me freedom to find my way in life, to learn my lessons and make my own mistakes. He loved being outdoors, especially in the Colorado Rockies. He loved taking his Jeep up really crummy back roads and bouncing around for hours, and the rest of us found that a little less enjoyable. I would get carsick. Once, I was with him on a backpack trip in Wyoming, sitting by a glassy, smooth wilderness lake, and along came 2 wild trumpeter swans flying low across the lake, so low that their wingtips made little ripples on the water as they were flying along with every wing beat. This is a golden memory that I have of my growing up with him. He was a lifelong jogger, and then when that was too hard on his knees, he'd go for daily walks. He did that right up until these last 2 months, often just walking back and forth in their condo when he'd become too weak. He loved to ski. The last time he skied, he was about 85, if you can imagine that. I was there. He was with my wife and I, and he made the best turns that I had ever seen him make, and I've never ever been able to figure that out. But he aggravated some arthritis in one of his knees, and he had to give it up after that. One of our most beloved family traditions over the last 40 years was to gather together in the mountains every year at Christmas time. We'd bundle up, adults, grandkids, and dogs, get a permit from the Forest Service, and then take an axe and drive out into the National Forest and find a Christmas tree. After we had the tree, we'd build a fire following his careful instructions about creating little chimneys. I heard him say that 1,000 times. For the flames to follow, and pretty soon we'd have a roaring fire to cook hot dogs and baked beans, heat up the baked beans and roast marshmallows to make s'mores. Sometimes it wasn't much above zero, but he loved those times, being huddled with us around a campfire. Some other things that he really liked: having a barbecue pit, because cooking steaks over charcoal was one of his real specialties. Medium rare was the way he liked it. Making hot buttered rum on special occasions. Corn on the cob dripping with butter. Ketchup, his flavoring of choice on virtually everything. Singing with his great tenor voice, always ready to harmonize. Barbershop quartets. Teaching my sons to drive his riding mower. Reading absolutely everything. He had piles of magazines on every subject. Round tables. He loved round tables because he felt that they brought everyone into the conversation. Watching Westerns with his grandkids. And he had a special weakness for chipmunks and especially hummingbirds. He loved hummingbirds. He and my mom loved to travel. In the summer of 2013, when he was 92 and Mom was 93, they decided to go on a huge road trip. All we knew was that they were heading west. A few days after they had started this trip, they called up to say hello, and they were sitting in their car, which had been loaded up onto a flatbed AAA truck. Because they'd had a flat tire and their spare tire was defective. So they and their car were being transported off to a town 25 miles away. But it turns out they were somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, and it was 105, 106 degrees. This is the punchline of this story from them. Roasting hot. They were sitting in their car on the top of this flatbed truck with their engine running in the car so that they could have the air conditioning running the whole time and not roast themselves. And they were all excited about this adventure. They got the tire fixed and they continued on. This is 2013, not that long ago. Later on in this same trip, they called up again and they had just finished a 2-mile hike in Arches National Park using their walking sticks. And this was right at the end of the summer. Then near the end of this trip, they called up again from some little town in Colorado where they were sitting in a restaurant and there was a freak thunderstorm going on that had caused a flash flood and water was coming under the front door of the restaurant. No end of adventure. Am I right, Mom? I mean, they loved that trip. I could go on indefinitely with my memories of him, but what struck me as most important is how much he cared about not just the people in his life, his family and his friends, but about people in general. He was enormously considerate. He loved and cared for other people, and they sent that love and care back to him. He treated everyone, cab drivers to presidents, with the same respect and interest. Of all the experiences of his life, nothing was more important to him than of having been in a band of brothers, being in a group of people like the Marine Corps, who were more afraid of failing their comrades than of losing their own lives. Beginning with his very first mission in World War II, as Jack Daly told us earlier tonight, or this afternoon, and then again over the years, he lost a whole group of friends, some in combat, some in accidents, and he never entirely got over those losses. It choked him up to talk about. I'll finish with one more very recent memory, and this really happened. This is my wife and I were visiting my parents this last October, back on October 18th. We had just finished eating dinner with them, and we were sitting at the dinner table in their condo here in Columbus. Their round dinner table. You like the round table. We were all talking and somehow got onto the subject of Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, and Dad was remembering being at Neil's 80th birthday party, I think it was. He described Neil sitting down at that party at the end of it and playing September's song on the piano and singing that song, Neil singing this. And then, sitting there at the table with us, back on October 18th at their round table, my father began to quietly sing, and he sang that whole song to us, to my mother and my wife and I, because we happened to be sitting there with him, but it felt like he was really singing this to everybody in his life that he cared about. And this is what he sang to us. Oh, it's a long, long while from May to December, but the days grow short when you reach September. When the autumn weather turns leaves to flame, one hasn't got time for the waiting game. Oh, the days dwindle down to a precious few, September, November, and these few precious days I'll spend with you. These precious days I'll spend with you.
Like my brother said, we're so grateful all of you are here. And when Dave and I were planning this time for our father, one thing we wanted was for there to be friends, not the people who didn't know Dad, but the people who really knew him. And I hope that you're able to hear that President Drake, Charlie, see, you used the names, Jack, and that these people are our friends and have known Dad in all the different parts of his life. And Mr. Bolden, of course, Jack and Charlie. And someone has been mentioned a couple of times, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, that our lives were intertwined with a wonderful family, the Kennedy family. And when Ethel and Robert wanted to come today, it had tremendous meaning for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Ethel and Bobby. Those memories are beyond heartache and joy. Thank you so much for being here for Dad and Mother. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank, I certainly am not going to list them, but Dad died about 9 days ago, and in the period of time from his death to today, there have been a group of people who have come together with unbelievable love, strength, support, and energy to celebrate him. They knew him well, and they absolutely made this day possible, this time possible. When we were going to the funeral home to see Dad's body, I knew I wanted to write something to put in the casket. And I started writing my letter to him. And as I wrote it, I realized that I was actually writing what I wanted to say to all of you. So this is a letter. This is the letter I started. And so you'll hear me refer to him as my father. Many people have mentioned, of course, February 20th, 1962. From that day to this, people have come up to me and have said, gosh, what's it like? I mean, John Glenn's your father. He's a hero. I mean, what's that like to have a hero for a father? And from the very first time, I think, that I was asked that, I thought about it, and I said, he's just my dad. You have been my teacher, my nemesis, yes, my singing partner, you tenor, me melody, and my source. I'll just ask Dad. You taught me to parallel park a car, tie knots, tie a necktie, and slide a car on ice. You recommended I memorize my social security number. And I learned from you, Westerns are a high form of entertainment and the white hats always win. And he had two. When you and Mother married, you told her, I can't promise you much, but I can promise life won't be boring. In time, Dave and I lived that promise too. Life with you, Dad, was never boring. World War II, Korea, the speed run in Project Bullet, Name That Tune, test pilot to NASA and Friendship 7, 4 terms in the US Senate, Discovery STS-95, and the Glenn College here at OSU. Like I said, never boring. Shortly after you got your drive to Washington, as a drive each other and higher and aid. Your belief in our democracy was clear several years ago in despair about the direction our government was going. Your counsel to me was prescient. You said our democracy was designed to move like a pendulum, far left to far right, always seeking the middle. Your words reassured me then and reassure me now. You also taught responsibility comes with our citizenship, and it is important to be well informed by truth and science, and that public service is the responsibility of each citizen. I remember when I was 8 years old, I had some good grades I wanted to share with Dad, and I showed them to him, and his response was, yes, but what have you done for your country today? Oft repeated in our family, what have you done for your country today? You were teaching me our country is more important than any individual, and our country is stronger when we each do our part. Although I admit, as an 8-year-old, I wanted a bit more attagirl and a little less God Bless America. In your heart, Dad, you remained a small-town boy, and you wore celebrity lightly and taught us the same. Though you met presidents, CEOs, kings and queens, you had a common touch with people at a gas station or at a Bob Evans where you and Mother would stop for fried mush and scrambled eggs. The son of a small-town plumber, as Dave mentioned, you kept one of Grandpa Glenn's wrenches on your desk as a reminder of where you came from. And you gifted a wrench to my brother, to Dave, and to me. Naturally shy, you often wore a ball cap so you wouldn't be recognized. But your civility and small-town manners would take over when you entered a building. Off came the cap, people would recognize you, and autographs, shaking hands, and selfies would commence, and you did it with grace and willingness and joy. Only once did I see you refuse to sign an autograph. You were running to make a vote on the Senate floor. A person asked you for an autograph. You asked the person to wait. They did, and you signed an autograph on the way back to the office. Another simple gesture you made was to pick up Buckeyes as you walked across the Capitol grounds on the way to and from your Senate office. You put the Buckeyes in a bowl in the waiting room of your office so visitors could take a little piece of Ohio home with them. And you never allowed your name or picture to be used to make money because you said you were a government employee and it wouldn't be right to make money from government service. In 1962, after Friendship 7, however, General Mills offered you $1 million, and we were told it might even come up to $5 million to be on a Wheaties box. This was an unimaginable amount of money for our family, living on a Marine pilot's pay, even with flight pay. You turned the offer down. You remained true to your small-town nature, Dad, and your heart also remained true to the values of the Marine Corps. This is to your very burial, Dad. Dad, you chose a Marine-issue casket, like the ones most Marines ask for. You asked that enlisted Marines carry you to your grave, and you wore Marine green to go to your grave, too. I love that after Echo Taps is played at your burial, you want Revelry to be played because you said, I'll be getting up in a whole new dimension, and you said it with a grin. Earlier in this remembrance, I said you were a teacher, and you taught me more than just trying to tie a knot or memorizing my Social Security number. During the life you shared with Mother, you were tender with and supportive of her, especially with her stuttering. When Mother gave her very first speech, you didn't go with her. You listened on a phone and cried. You knew she had to stand alone and not in your shadow. And you were an elder in our Presbyterian church. But I think I learned more about religious practice watching how you lived your life. You treated other people as you wanted to be treated. You were true to your word with a handshake. You gave to the Salvation Army and lived with humility and gratitude. Once I asked for your insight and guidance when I thought I had a good idea for an investment. After we talked for a while, you thought, and you said, well, yes, but how much is enough? In today's world, your words almost seem quaint, but they should be a standard. How much is enough? You were more self-educated by your natural curiosity than any degree might have bestowed. And Google and Safari gave room for your imagination and curious nature to explore the universe. I learned from you age is not just a number, that aging can be full and meaningful. The Glenn Institute became the Glenn School and is now the Glenn College. I am so grateful you lived to know your legacy of public service and meaningful policy will endure. You challenged another assumption about aging, Dad. You flew your pressurized Beech Baron, referred to as Annie Air, until you were 90. To confirm your skills as a pilot, you took a flight physical every year and completed a long weekend of training and testing provided by Beech Aircraft. But macular degeneration caught up with you, and one of the saddest consequences of the disease, it compromised your ability to see sunsets. It was heartbreaking for you and a heartache for me. Now, here we are, your funeral. Folks from around the world in all walks of life remember and honor you, Dad. You lived many lives in one life with honesty, grace, belief in our country, and the honor of public service. I am proud and so grateful to say you're just my dad. Thank you, Dad. I love you. Godspeed, Dad.
Annie's been it. We've been together ever since we were in junior high school. Our parents used to kid us that we were in playpens together. Why, from then on, it was the two of us together. They were things that I thought were important and were important for the country, and that she thought were important for the country too. And so we've been in this as a team together.
By any measure, accomplishment, service, courage, John Glenn was a great man. When I think of John Glenn, I think of a good man. My first taste of John Glenn, the good man, was on March 4th, 1968, at the Madison Theater in Mansfield, Ohio. 50 teenage boys had gathered for our Eagle Scout dinner. Colonel Glenn was the speaker. John Glenn, national hero, shook hands with each one of us. John Glenn, perhaps the most famous man of his generation, took a picture with us one at a time. He always made time for you no matter your station in life. That lesson has stuck with me. 39 years later, former Senator John Glenn walked me down the center aisle of the United States Senate to be sworn in. And of course, like the Eagle Scouts of 4 decades earlier, all the new senators wanted to meet their American hero. And he was kind to senators too. I had the honor to see John Glenn up close at work and at play, with family and with strangers. Every presidential year, Ohio's most prominent Democrat would board a bus with our presidential or vice presidential nominee to campaign around Ohio. I watched the retired senator, a mentor to so many of us, reconnect with Senator Kerry in 2004, with Senator Biden in 2008. I saw him for the first time, I was sitting on the bus with him, meet the young senator from Illinois, and the immediate connection that the American icon and the future president made. At one stop, this was a decade after his retirement from the Senate, John Glenn got off the bus, jumped over a ditch, and shook the outstretched hand of an appreciative farmer. John was there in non-presidential years for Ohio Democrats too. In 2006, we boarded a, shall we say, older, less opulent Winnebago with the Ohio Democratic ticket to campaign through small town in rural Ohio. As we traveled up and down and over the hills of John and Annie's beloved Southeast Ohio, the rest of us began to get car sick. But of course, not the 85-year-old astronaut who simply smiled at us. And I saw the elder statesman as he'd get off the bus and speak to one adoring crowd after another, transferring some of his magic to us. John was an FDR Democrat. Roosevelt saved America, after all, John said. An FDR Democrat who cared about justice and cared about opportunity for people with less privilege than most of us in this room have. He never forgot, as Dave talked about, he never forgot the terror that struck his 10 or 11-year-old heart when he overheard his parents saying that their home was about to be foreclosed upon. It was a New Deal government-backed FHA loan that allowed John's father to renegotiate with the bank and keep his family in their home. John knew, as he later wrote in his memoir, that government can change people's lives for the better. Some say that John's brand of patriotic optimism is a throwback to a bygone era, but we need it now more than ever. John believed in an activist government and an active citizenship. He warned that cynicism and apathy were a threat to democracy itself. John's friend Robert Kennedy, who helped to convince him to run for the Senate, said that politics was a calling almost like the ministry. Presbyterian John liked those words. The happiest and most fulfilled people I've known, he told us, are those who devoted themselves to something bigger and more profound than their own self-interest. That drove John's activism and his public service. It drove him to create the Glenn Institute, becoming the Glenn School, becoming the Glenn College, to inspire the next generation of active, engaged citizens. A friend who worked for John 30 years ago in his Senate office told me this week, John Glenn took such joy in helping others and was so proud of his staff. Even when you left, you were still family. John Glenn was the only Ohioan ever to be elected 4 times to the United States Senate. He was a workhorse, never a show horse. He labored over the details of non-proliferation and environmental cleanup of nuclear disposal sites, grunt work to some, but John was content to spend his time not on collecting instant headlines, but achieving lasting results that would leave the world better than he had found it. He helped create the independent watchdogs we know as inspectors general to keep the government he believed in accountable to the people it serves. He had the foresight to found the Great Lakes Task Force, which continues to play such an important role to protect the health of our Great Lake. The night before the 50th anniversary of Colonel Glenn's space launch, Connie and I had dinner in German Village with Annie and John and Lynn and David and Karen. As the evening wound down, we headed to the door together. The valet pulled up in front of the restaurant with John's Cadillac. The 91-year-old astronaut hopped in the driver's seat, Annie in the front seat, and the kids, now all on the other side of 60, piled in the back. Some things just never change. And oh, how they were in love, Annie and John. I spoke with Annie in April, called them on their 75th wedding anniversary. She told me they had waited to get married until after John finished his flight training. We wanted to get married in high school, Annie said, but our parents wouldn't let us because they said it would never last. And how they loved David and Lynn, as we saw today. John had a way of making everyone around him feel important, from the teenage Eagle Scouts to the farmers in the field. He lived his life by Matthew 25, where Jesus admonished his followers, "Whenever you did it for any of my people, no matter how unimportant they seemed, you did it for me." John Glenn, a great man. John Glenn, such a good man. I think I need.
He's still handy that way, Annie. 4 years ago, John and Annie entered the hotel suite we had reserved for election night and were immediately swarmed by awestruck admirers. This is how it was with those two always, and I've never known them to be anything but gracious with strangers. In the wake of my essay about John for the Plain Dealer, I've been on the receiving end of a steady stream of stories about random encounters with John and Annie. Every one of those stories has a happy ending. On that night in 2012, our 4-year-old grandson Clayton was with us. He had spent much of the day rehearsing a question he wanted to ask John. I introduced him, and I told John that Clayton had something on his mind. Immediately, tall, lanky John leaned in so that he could talk face to face with our little boy. "What's your question?" John said. Clayton didn't hesitate. "How do astronauts go to the bathroom in space?" John smiled. "Well now, that's an interesting question, isn't it?" Clayton nodded, and those of us within earshot gathered round for astronaut John Glenn's 10-minute tutorial on the machinations of urination in space. After he finished, Clayton thanked him and shook his hand and started making the rounds to share his new expertise. I hugged John and I thanked him for treating Clayton with such respect. "Well, why wouldn't I?" he said. "Children have sincere questions and they deserve sincere answers." Clayton is 8 years old now, and we visited him just last weekend, and one of the first things he said to me was, "I'm sorry you lost your friend, Grandma. He was my friend, too." Last week, Sheridan and I learned from Lynn that our beloved friend was dying. Lynn, we will never forget the kindness you showed us by asking us to send you text messages that you could read to your father. Thank you for that. Sheridan was in Washington, as you know. I was in Austin. I had just landed in Texas. Thank you. In my message, I reminded John of that conversation he'd had with our grandson, and I told him I've lost count of the number of times I've shared that story as an illustration of what we gain when we engage with civility. If American icon John Glenn could take the time to treat a child with such respect, surely we can find ways to listen to one another. One of my most enduring memories of John as a friend and mentor involves his two-pronged sense of empathy and timing. He and Annie sat behind me during one of Sherrod's campaign debates in 2012. And when Sherrod's opponent called him a liar, John's hands immediately pressed on my shoulders to keep me in my seat. He leaned in and he whispered, "Me too, but not now." John was a man of his time who kept up with the times. Never was that more obvious to me than when he encouraged me to keep writing and sharing my opinions. I once joked with John and Annie that I had flunked political wife training. Neither of them laughed. Instead, Annie grabbed one of my hands and John grabbed the other. "Listen to me," he said in a stern voice. "You are who you are, and that is why we love you." Annie squeezed my hand and added, "Never stop speaking your mind." I will never forget the way John turned and locked eyes with Annie. "Listen to my Annie," he said. "I always do." That is the part of John Glenn that we must not lose in all these tributes. He loved his wife. He loved his Annie, and he never tired of letting everyone know. One afternoon, we visited their apartment with actor Martin Sheen, who was in Ohio to campaign for Sherrod. John was as excited to see West Wing's President Bartlett as Martin was to see astronaut John Glenn, who had recently won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. When it was time for all of us to leave for a fundraising event, John held out his elbow for Annie. Annie had other plans. "Annie," Martin said, grinning in that impish way of his, "may I escort you?" Annie looped her arm around his and smiled at John. We'll see you when you get there. John turned to me in mock horror. Did you see that? She just dumped me. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk the length of the hallway, beaming like a boyfriend. The last time Sherrod and I spent time alone with John and Annie was at their apartment here in Columbus. As soon as I sat down on the couch, John pointed to where I was seated and said to Annie, "She's sitting where Hillary sat." And until that moment, neither us nor certainly any member of the media had known that Hillary had just stopped by to visit. For more than an hour, we talked about the presidential race and we talked about the future of our country, but we also swapped stories about our children and our grandchildren. John was a bit slower, but only in movement. His mind was sharp as ever. As we prepared to leave, he made clear to us in his engineer's voice that he knew time was running out. "You can only replace the parts so long," he said, putting a hand on each of our shoulders. "Eventually, you need a new chassis." We were quiet on that elevator ride back to the lobby, each of us taking in what John was telling us. Once again, our friend was answering the question, this one unspoken, as honestly as he could. One last time, John Glenn was leading the way. "Annie, I am here as your friend, too, and as a fellow political wife. How you and I have laughed over the years at that silly definition of who we are. We didn't marry politics. We married the men we love. You once told me that John was your hero, too, but for reasons far more personal and meaningful than the public could ever know. Well, John knew, Annie. Once over dinner, in a room packed with his admirers, I mentioned to John how inspiring your marriage is to me. He leaned in and with the softest eyes said, "Oh, Connie, I am who I am because of Annie." We love you, Annie.
A little over 75 years ago, Annie Castor was set to give her senior organ recital at Muskingum College. On the way there, 20-year-old John Glenn was listening to his car radio and learned of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After the concert, the two of them sat together and talked. He told her about the attack and of his plan to enlist. December 7th, 1941, the pieces of their life came together and they mapped out their future. One of the pieces of music that she played that day was Finlandia by Sibelius. It became a very important piece of music for her and her soon-to-be husband. The Muskingum Choir will now sing "Be Still My Soul," a hymn text set to the tune of Finlandia. Someone goes up to Jesus and asks him, "What's the most important thing? What matters the most?" And Jesus answers, "Love God with everything in you, and love your neighbor in the same way." Throughout his life, John Glenn never lost sight of what mattered the most. He loved and served God. He loved and served his neighbor. It's just that for him, that category of neighbor got bigger and bigger until he saw the whole human family as his neighbor. That perspective, that way of seeing the world is very biblical. If you listen to the deep rhythms of the Bible, you cannot miss God's overriding concern for the public good, for creating a just and merciful society, for protecting the rights and welfare of those most vulnerable. And God has a special fondness for those willing to promote the common good. People who are willing to roll up their sleeves, to do the hard, messy work of helping our communities work better, of creating just laws and societies. This is complicated, hard work, and I'm not sure there is a higher or harder calling. Throughout his adult life, Senator Glenn shared his gifts to work towards that common good as a pilot, astronaut, senator, and his work in creating the John Glenn School. But his legacy is not limited to students enrolled in the school. His legacy is available to all of us. For one who traveled so far, who soared so high, he never left the rest of us behind. He always took us with him. Earlier this week, I asked Mrs. Glenn about her husband's faith. She answered, quote, "We didn't talk about it much because it was in us," end quote. The Glenns are of a generation that rarely spoke about their faith. they lived it. Faith got in John Glenn at a young age, and it took root. He had a deep, lifelong connection to God and to the church. And that connection shaped the trajectory of his life, giving him the courage to dare greatly and the wisdom to live humbly. And he knew in life and in death he belonged to God. Senator Glenn did something that is rarely done. And I'm not talking about any of the accomplishments that have been mentioned today. The rare thing he did was he lived a life that fully and completely reflected his deepest values. His priorities were in his bloodstream, his values embedded in the synapses of his brain. That's why the Philippians passage the family chose for today is so appropriate. His life embodies those words. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in John Glenn. And the God of peace will be with you. The tradition I represent, the tradition in which John Glenn was baptized and so shaped his life, makes the claim that today, at this very moment, he is all right. He is not lost, but he is found. At this very moment, he is whole, complete, well. He is now cradled in the arms of love. God is holding him tight, and God will never, ever let him go. Today we give thanks to God for the life and witness of John Glenn. Let us pray. O God, our strength and our Redeemer, giver of life and conqueror of death, we open our hearts to you. We give thanks for your servant John Glenn and for his life among us. We give thanks for all the ways in which he shared his life with the world and stole our hearts. We celebrate his sense of wonder, how he met challenges with quiet joy. Today, we give thanks for his deep commitment to his family, and we remember his faithfulness to you. God of boundless compassion, be with all who are mourning. We pray for his cherished wife, for his beloved children and their families. Oh, be with all who are missing him this day. Help us to know that nothing, including death, can separate us from your love. Give us such faith that by day and night, in all times and in all places, we may without fear entrust those who are dear to us to your never-failing love in this life and in the life to come. Amen. Our prayers continue as the choir sings the Lord's Prayer.
Hallowed
into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory
High flight. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand, and touched the face of God. Let us pray. Into your hands, merciful Savior, we commend your servant John. Acknowledge, we pray, a sheep of your fold, a lamb of your flock. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light. Amen. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord be kind and gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and grant you peace. Amen. Now please rise as we render military honors and remain in place until the program is complete.
When we seek for the word falling leaves drift by the window, the autumn leaves of red and gold. I see your lips, the summer kisses, the sunburned